Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World. And here is today's content. When I look at the Trump administration's decision to formally associate Nicolás Maduro with a foreign terrorist organization, I do not view it as a simple escalation in rhetoric. I see it as a calibrated shift in the architecture of U.S. power, one that reflects Washington's deeper strategy toward Venezuela and the broader geopolitical landscape of the Western Hemisphere labels in U.S. Foreign policy are never merely symbolic. They are legal instruments, political signals, and strategic tools rolled into one. And when the term terrorism is invoked, it marks a deliberate attempt to reframe adversary from a political opponent into a security threat. From where I stand, the designation is part of a long-standing pattern in U.S. statecraft, the use of legal categories, terrorist, narco-trafficker, rogue regime, to delegitimize governments that resist American influence. What is striking is not that the U.S. opposes Maduro's authoritarianism and catastrophic governance. What is striking is the choice of mechanism. By invoking the framework of terrorism, Washington is attempting to strip the Maduro government of its remaining diplomatic legitimacy, opening the door to far more aggressive tools of coercion, from the expansion of financial sanctions to the criminalization of any entity, foreign or domestic, that deals with Caracas. This is the first question we must confront, honestly. Does this signal preparation for military intervention? In my judgment, it does not automatically indicate plans for an invasion. The United States has neither the domestic political appetite nor the regional support for a large-scale military operation in South America. Latin America carries a deep and painful memory of foreign interference, and most governments, even those critical of Maduro, would resist U.S. boots on Venezuelan soil. However, what the designation does signal is Washington's shift toward what I call coercive hybrid warfare, maximum economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, intelligence operations, support for dissident factions, and the tightening of legal nooses around individuals linked to the regime. These tools do not require congressional authorization. They are cheaper, faster, and politically advantageous for a White House seeking to appear decisive without assuming the costs of war. I also cannot ignore the domestic political calculus. Venezuela, like Cuba, has become a symbolic battleground in U.S. politics, especially in Florida, where exile communities reward hawkish postures. Trump understands this well. A strong stance against Maduro plays into a broader narrative of being tough on socialism. In this sense, the terrorist label functions as an instrument not only of foreign policy, but of electoral strategy. Yet the most important reality is this: the label does not solve a single one of Venezuela's underlying crises: hyperinflation, hunger mass, emigration, institutional collapse. Instead, it risks deepening them. Sanctions and designations often hit populations harder than leaders. I have seen this pattern in numerous countries: economic isolation, entrenches authoritarianism rather than dislodging it. This is why I approach Washington's move with concern. It is a strategy of pressure without a strategy of resolution. It escalates without guiding toward diplomacy, and it treats a suffering society as a chessboard for great power signaling. The real question, therefore, is not whether Trump is preparing to attack militarily, but whether he is preparing for a new phase of coercive confrontation, one that could destabilize an entire region while failing to bring Venezuela closer to political or economic recovery. When I analyze the Trump administration's approach to Venezuela, I see a strategy rooted not in a coherent regional vision, but in a blend of domestic politics, ideological theatrics, and cost-minimizing coercion. Washington's designation of Maduro as linked to a foreign terrorist organization is a telling expression of this strategy. It is not the opening shot of a conventional war. It is the foundation for a low-cost, high-pressure campaign aimed at either breaking the regime from within or forcing it into deeper isolation. To understand Trump's motives, we must begin with the political geography of the United States. No state matters more to Trump's electoral calculus than Florida. And within Florida, few communities carry more political weight than Cuban, Venezuelan, and Nicaraguan exiles, groups that view leftist governments in Latin America not merely as ideological rivals, but as existential enemies. For Trump, being perceived as tough on Maduro is not just foreign policy. It is campaign strategy finely tuned to the emotional memory of exile communities who fled authoritarian rule. But beyond domestic politics lies a second key element: Trump's desire to achieve regime change without committing the United States to another costly military venture. He has been consistent, even if contradictory. At times, he rails against endless wars, yet surrounds himself with advisors who see window after window for coercive brinkmanship. The outcome is a hybrid doctrine aggressive enough to signal dominance, yet restrained enough to avoid war's financial and political burdens. By designating Maduro under terrorism statutes, Trump's administration unlocks a powerful array of legal and financial tools, more expansive sanctions authority, the ability to target foreign banks dealing with Venezuela, potential criminal exposure for individuals interacting with Caracas, and stronger justification for covert activities. This is not a prelude to tanks on the streets of Caracas. It is an effort to tighten the noose around Maduro, economically, diplomatically, and psychologically, while keeping U.S. costs low. Yet beneath this tactical maneuvering is a deeper structural objective: intimidate the regime's external backers, especially Russia, China, and Iran. By framing Maduro as a terrorist actor, Washington aims to raise the political cost for major powers of supporting him. The message is clear: if you want to be in Maduro's corner, you will do so at the risk of U.S. legal and financial retaliation. This brings us to the critical question: is this strategy likely to succeed? From my perspective, the answer is mixed. The Trump administration hopes that by combining political stigma, economic suffocation, and internal stress, parts of Maduro's coalition, military elites, oil, technocrats, political insiders, might fracture. In theory, such fissures could produce a negotiated transition or even a palace coup. But U.S. history suggests otherwise. When Washington escalates sanctions and applies maximalist pressure, regimes often become more entrenched, relying on repression, propaganda, and alternative patrons. In Venezuela's case, the more the U.S. tightens its grip, the more Maduro leans on Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. The strategy thus risks transforming Venezuela into a geopolitical proxy arena, deepening its internal suffering without bringing the crisis any closer to resolution. Trump's calculus is brutally simple: achieve maximum political gain domestically while minimizing foreign entanglement. Yet this approach, though efficient in the short term, often leaves behind a trail of unintended consequences: regional instability, humanitarian disasters, and fractured diplomatic landscapes. In the case of Venezuela, I fear the same pattern is unfolding once again. When I think about how Nicolás Maduro will react to being labeled a terrorist by the United States, I see a predictable but deeply consequential pattern playing out. Dictatorships under existential pressure do not soften, they harden. They do not open up, they close. They do not cede legitimacy. They weaponize nationalism, sovereignty, and anti-imperialist identity. Maduro is no exception. The first and most immediate reaction will be political defiance. Maduro will see Washington's labeling of him not as a condemnation of his government, but as an imperialist attack on Venezuelan sovereignty. This narrative is deeply rooted in Latin American political history, and it resonates powerfully across sectors of Venezuelan society. For Maduro, the terrorist label is not a threat, but an opportunity, a chance to rally his base, demonize the opposition, and revive the Chavista myth of heroic resistance to foreign aggression. In his view, cooperation, or appearing weak, will only increase internal dissent. The only viable alternative is confrontation. The second response will be to tighten domestic control. When regimes feel cornered, they turn inward, relying on coercion rather than legitimacy. I fully expect Maduro to expand security surveillance, strengthen ties with intelligence agencies, and increase pressure on political opposition groups. Civil society organizations, journalists, and dissidents will likely face increased scrutiny, all justified on the grounds that Venezuela is defending itself against a foreign-backed destabilization campaign. This internal rigidity is not merely political, it is psychological. A regime under siege sees enemies everywhere, real or imagined. The terrorist label will amplify this siege mentality. Third, Maduro will pursue deeper alliances with non-Western powers, but with a new urgency. The designation sends a clear message to the world: doing business with Venezuela is now riskier. U.S. financial retaliation becomes more likely, and foreign companies must think twice before doing business with Caracas. For Maduro, this means quickly finding support from partners willing to defy Washington. Russia will remain his most trusted geopolitical guarantor, providing intelligence, cooperation, military advisory support, and diplomatic cover at the United Nations. China, though more cautious, will maintain a selective but pragmatic relationship, especially in the energy and infrastructure sectors, although Beijing is careful not to incur direct U.S. sanctions. Iran, meanwhile, will likely increase cooperation in areas such as fuel, transport, drone technology, and parallel trade networks. In essence, Maduro's response will be to pivot more deeply into the orbit of America's global rivals, creating precisely the kind of proxy dynamics that destabilize the region rather than stabilize it. This is the paradox of U.S. coercion. The more Washington isolates a regime, the more it seeks shelter from rival powers. Finally, I predict that Maduro will try to portray himself as the victim of unilateral U.S. intervention on the international stage. He will appeal to the non-aligned movement, African and Asian governments skeptical of U.S. interventionism in the global South more generally. And many of these countries, regardless of their views on Maduro, will agree with the criticism of unilateral U.S. labeling. This, in my view, is the core of the challenge. Washington's escalation does not weaken Maduro's geopolitical position. It deepens it within opposition networks. It does not fracture his coalition. It strengthens it against a common external threat. In short, Maduro will not back down. He will resist, repress, and restructure, and Venezuela's crisis will deepen within the geopolitical fault lines of the modern world. When I focus on Venezuela's economic reality under the new U.S. terrorist designation, I see a society already in collapse being pushed into even deeper despair. The Venezuelan economy, after years of mismanagement, corruption, hyperinflation, and declining oil output, is now being subjected to the most severe form of external coercion the United States can impose. And what concerns me profoundly is that these measures, though aimed at Maduro, fall overwhelmingly on the shoulders of ordinary Venezuelans. Let me begin with the basics. Designating Maduro as tied to a terrorist organization massively expands the reach of U.S. sanctions. It effectively criminalizes any international financial institution, shipping company, refinery, or commodity trader that interacts with Venezuela's state apparatus. The result is near total economic isolation. Foreign banks shut down transactions. Insurance firms refuse to cover ships carrying Venezuelan crude. Port authorities hesitate to receive Venezuelan tankers. Even humanitarian shipments become legally entangled. I have seen this pattern before in Iran and Iraq in the 1,990 seconds in North Korea. Once the terrorism framework is invoked, the economic system of a country enters a state of paralysis, not because of explicit bans, but because global markets fear U.S. retaliation. This is where sanctions wield their quiet but devastating power. For a country as economically fragile as Venezuela, this is catastrophic. The oil sector, the foundation of the country's revenue, continues to contract. Production is already far below historical levels due to years of underinvestment and technical decay. With enhanced sanctions, the few remaining foreign partners will withdraw even further, leaving PDVSA unable to maintain basic operations. Oil revenues will drop, state capacity will shrink, social services already dysfunctional will degrade further. Hyperinflation, which has ravaged the economy for years, will intensify as imports dry up, and the Bolivar loses even more credibility. Food and medicine shortages, already severe, will deepen. The country will continue to hemorrhage people as millions more Venezuelans flee to Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Chile, and beyond. These migration flows will destabilize neighboring countries, strain public services, and ignite new cycles of xenophobia, political friction, and humanitarian crisis. What makes this especially tragic is that sanctions do not simply block trade. They reshape the economy itself. As the formal sector collapses, informal, illicit, and militarized networks take its place. Black markets flourish, gold smuggling expands, drug trafficking infiltrates state structures. The economy becomes criminalized because that is the only terrain where transactions can take place. What Washington calls maximum pressure becomes on the ground a recipe for state fragmentation and social decay. Maduro's regime, ironically, can survive such conditions more easily than the population. Authoritarian governments often adapt by consolidating control over remaining revenue streams and illicit networks. The poor cannot. They are the ones who face malnutrition, lack of medicine, broken hospitals, collapsed schools, and wages that cannot buy a single day of food. Children suffer first and suffer most. As an economist, I must emphasize that sanctions of this scale rarely achieve their political goals. They do not produce democratic transitions. They do not create good governance. They do not empower civil society. Instead, they create desperation, fragmentation, and long-term economic scarring. This is why I view Washington's decision with such concern. By intensifying Venezuela's economic collapse, the United States may believe it is weakening Maduro. In reality, it is weakening Venezuela itself, its institutions, its social fabric, its future. And once a society collapses to this degree, rebuilding it is not a matter of months or even years. It becomes a generational undertaking. The terrorist designation, therefore, is not simply a geopolitical signal. It is an economic earthquake, one that shakes the foundations of a nation already standing on fractured ground. When I extend my analysis beyond Venezuela's borders and look at Latin America as a whole, I see a region thrust into a dangerous strategic imbalance. The Trump administration's decision to brand Maduro as affiliated with a terrorist organization will not remain contained within Venezuela. It will radiate outward economically, politically, and psychologically across an entire hemisphere that has long lived under the shadow of U.S. intervention. And it will force Latin American governments to confront old fears, buried traumas, and new strategic uncertainties. Let me begin with the most immediate impact, the refugee crisis. Venezuela's collapse has already produced one of the largest displacements in modern history. Over 7 million people have fled the country. With intensified sanctions and the new terrorist designation, these flows will accelerate. Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, and Chile will absorb the brunt, straining social services, inflaming xenophobia, and fueling political tension. These countries do not have the fiscal or institutional capacity to absorb another wave without destabilizing their own internal politics. Next, I consider regional governments. Many Latin American presidents, especially in South America's largest democracies, are deeply wary of anything that resembles a U.S.-engineered regime change campaign. The memory of military coups, covert operations, and Cold War interventionism still shapes political consciousness across the continent. Even leaders critical of Maduro's governance hesitate to align with Washington's escalation. Their fear is simple. If the United States can unilaterally designate an elected or formerly elected leader in Latin America as a terrorist, then no government is safe from similar treatment in the future. Brazil, under its current leadership, will call for diplomacy and reject U.S. pressure tactics. Colombia finds itself divided. Its political class fears instability along its border, but also knows its national security is tied to avoiding regional escalation. Mexico will distance itself from Washington's approach, entirely emphasizing sovereignty and non-intervention. The Caribbean states, traditionally sympathetic to Venezuela or cautious of U.S. hegemony, will push for dialogue through regional organizations. This divergence is dangerous. Instead of uniting Latin America around a common response to Venezuela's crisis, Washington's escalation risks fracturing hemispheric diplomacy and dividing the region into rival blocs. Once again, Latin America may find itself caught between competing geopolitical pressures, this time not only from the United States, but also from Russia and China, who will portray themselves as defenders of sovereignty against U.S. overreach. Economic spillovers will deepen these divides. Countries hosting large migrant populations will face rising unemployment, fiscal strain, and social backlash. Border insecurity will increase as criminal networks exploit collapsing Venezuelan state structures. Regional trade flows will be disrupted as Venezuela falls further into informal markets and illicit economies. Underlying all of this is Latin America's historical memory. The region has experienced a century of foreign interference, from Guatemala to Chile, from Nicaragua to Cuba. The terrorist designation rekindles fears that Washington is returning to a punitive, unilateral, Cold War-era mindset, one that views Latin America not as a set of sovereign states, but as a strategic backyard. And this fear shapes behavior. Governments that might otherwise support a reasonable diplomatic transition in Venezuela now distance themselves to avoid appearing complicit in U.S. escalation. The result is paralysis at precisely the moment the region most needs coordination. In this sense, the terrorist label doesn't only isolate Maduro, it isolates the region from the possibility of a coherent collective response. It destabilizes not just Venezuela's future, but Latin America's fragile political trajectory. And it does so in a hemisphere already weakened by inequality, polarization, crime, and institutional fragility. This is the collateral damage of Washington's choices, damage that stretches far beyond Caracas. When I widen my lens beyond the Americas and examine how the Maduro terrorist designation reverberates across the global system, I see a much larger geopolitical game unfolding. Venezuela is no longer just a domestic crisis or even a hemispheric crisis. It has become a node in the emerging multipolar confrontation between the United States, Russia, China, and a broadening coalition of states wary of U.S. financial power. Washington may view this designation as a tactical move, but Moscow and Beijing interpret it as a strategic signal another case in which the U.S. is weaponizing its legal and financial systems to shape political outcomes far beyond its borders. Let me start with Russia, because Moscow has been Venezuela's most explicit geopolitical patron. For the Kremlin, supporting Maduro is not merely about oil deals or arms contracts. It is about demonstrating that U.S. efforts at regime change, whether in Ukraine, Syria, or Latin America, can be resisted. Putin understands that if Maduro falls to U.S. pressure, it strengthens Washington's narrative of primacy and weakens Moscow's credibility as a counterweight. The terrorist designation will therefore push Russia to deepen its commitments, more intelligence sharing, more military advisors, more technical specialists for the oil sector, and more diplomatic shielding at the UN Security Council. Russia sees Venezuela as a proxy arena in a global contest where every American action must be met with an equal and opposite force. In this view, Washington's escalation does not isolate Maduro, it hardens Moscow's resolve. China, meanwhile, responds differently, but no less significantly. Beijing has long been cautious in its involvement with Venezuela because it wants to protect its overseas investments without provoking direct confrontation with the United States. But the terrorist designation complicates this balancing act. China has billions of dollars in outstanding loans tied to Venezuelan oil. Walking away is not an option. Instead, Beijing will pursue quiet resistance, expanding non-dollar trade channels, restructuring debt in ways that bypass Western banking systems, and using state-owned companies to maintain essential operations in Venezuela. China does not care about Maduro personally. What it cares about is the principle: if the U.S. can unilaterally criminalize its partners, then Beijing must build alternative financial pathways to protect its global footprint. In this way, Venezuela becomes part of a much larger Chinese strategy to de-risk from U.S. financial dominance. This brings me to what I believe is the most important global consequence: the accelerated fragmentation of the financial order. The more Washington uses terrorist designations and sanctions as primary tools of statecraft, the more other major powers invest in parallel systems, non-SWIFT payment channels, local currency oil, trade sanctioned, resilient logistics networks, and sovereign digital currencies. These projects are no longer theoretical. They are spreading precisely because of cases like Venezuela. Iran will also seize the opportunity to deepen ties with Caracas, not just for ideological reasons, but because both countries share similar constraints, heavy sanctions, external pressure, and the need for alternative economic circuits. Iranian drones, fuel shipments, and barter arrangements are already flowing. The new designation will intensify this cooperation. In short, Washington views Venezuela as a local problem to be disciplined, but Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran view Venezuela as part of a global contest over who defines legitimacy, who controls financial flows, and who sets the rules of international order. This is why the terrorist designation is far more than an isolated policy. It is another fault line in a world moving steadily toward financial and geopolitical bifurcation, a world where coercion breeds resistance and resistance deepens fragmentation. As I take a final step back from the Maduro terrorist designation and the intensifying U.S.-Venezuela confrontation, I am struck by how familiar this geopolitical pattern has become. The United States facing a government it dislikes escalates pressure through legal instruments and financial sanctions. The targeted regime hardens, turns toward alternative patrons, and represses its own people. The civilian population suffers catastrophic economic decline. Regional neighbors absorb the humanitarian fallout, and the international system fractures even further along geopolitical lines. This is the cycle of coercive diplomacy without diplomacy, and it fails almost everywhere it is tried. The United States insists that its objective is democracy, but in practice, the strategy relies on tools, financial strangulation, diplomatic isolation, and securitized rhetoric that rarely empower democratic outcomes. They often produce the opposite: economic collapse, institutional decay, and authoritarian entrenchment. I have analyzed these patterns in Iraq, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, and now Venezuela. The lesson is consistent sanctions can weaken a society, but they almost never produce legitimacy, stability, or democratic renewal. This is why I believe Washington's decision to invoke the language of terrorism is so deeply problematic. It transforms a political crisis into a security crisis. It makes negotiation more difficult, not easier. It narrows the space for diplomacy at the very moment diplomacy is most needed. And it reinforces a dangerous message to the world that the United States can unilaterally define terrorism in ways that shape the fate of entire societies. But beyond the geopolitics lies an ethical question that we can no longer ignore. What is the purpose of international policy? To punish adversaries or to help societies recover? If the goal is punishment, then Washington's approach is succeeding. If the goal is recovery, we are heading in the wrong direction. A viable future for Venezuela will require something radically different from coercion. It will require negotiated transition, regional coordination, humanitarian protection, and genuine international cooperation. No regime change engineered from abroad has ever produced stable governance in Latin America. What works instead are inclusive political arrangements, power sharing, transitional justice, amnesties, electoral guarantees supported by regional institutions rather than imposed by external powers. Latin America itself must be part of this solution. The region has the diplomatic credibility and historical perspective to mediate Venezuela's crisis. A joint initiative involving Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, the Caribbean community, and the UN could form the basis of a new multilateral approach that respects sovereignty while addressing the humanitarian emergency. This is not idealistic, it is pragmatic. Countries that share borders, migration flows, and economic ties have far greater incentive to stabilize Venezuela than distant powers do. And the international community, particularly the United States, must recognize that economic recovery is not possible without economic inclusion. Sanctions must be paired with clear pathways for relief, tied to political benchmarks, not as punishment, but as incentives for peaceful transition. Isolation cannot rebuild a collapsed economy. Only investment cooperation and institutional reconstruction can. Ultimately, my deepest concern is not whether the Maduro regime survives. It is whether the Venezuelan people, already battered by years of crisis, can survive the next phase of geopolitical escalation. They are the ones who lose access to medicine, stability, food, electricity, and opportunity. They are the ones who flee by the millions. They are the ones trapped between authoritarianism and coercive foreign policy. This is the moral failure of our age. We treat societies as battlegrounds for power projection rather than communities whose dignity and development should be the foundation of global politics. If the international community wishes to avert further collapse, it must replace the politics of pressure with the politics of peace. It must replace unilateral coercion with multilateral engagement. And it must remember that the goal of foreign policy is not domination, but human flourishing.